The lion does not turn around when a small dog barks. You've heard that line before, haven't you? Harsh little sentence, cold, arrogant almost. But listen carefully. It is not arrogance when you finally stop begging the world to describe you correctly. It is survival. Because some of you are dying from a disease so ordinary, nobody even respects the funeral. The need to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding you. That disease will drain your face, your sleep, your confidence, your prayers, your focus, your appetite, your timing, your peace. You keep rehearsing explanations in your head for people who already chose the version of you that is easiest to mock. You keep trying to hand evidence to people who do not want truth, they want theater. They want a villain, a fool, a weak one, an arrogant one, an ungrateful one, anything that protects their ego from the shame of admitting you were never what they said you were. And that is the ugly miracle of judgment. It tells you more about their appetite than your identity. So let them stare, let them whisper, let them tilt their heads with that fake concern, that poisonous little concern that tastes like pity and envy at the same time. Let them judge you. Because if you know who you are, truly know, not perform, not advertise, not decorate, but know, then their noise becomes weather, annoying, loud, cold maybe, but weather. Not law, not destiny. Some of you are still kneeling emotionally in front of people who have never once stood honestly before God or before themselves. Why are you asking the blind to paint your face? Why are you asking the wounded to define your worth? Wake up. Not with rage first, with clarity. Rage comes later, clarity first. Because the day you stop chasing a fair verdict from unfair hearts is the day you begin to sound like yourself again. First, understand what judgment really is. It is rarely a careful conclusion. It is usually a confession wearing a mask. A man calls you arrogant because your boundaries make him feel small. A woman calls you cold because your silence refuses to entertain her chaos. A relative calls you changed because they can no longer reach into your life with dirty hands and call it love. That's the thing nobody teaches you when you're still tender and eager and stupid enough to believe sincerity gets rewarded automatically. People do not always judge what you are. They judge what you stop giving them access to. You think they hate your attitude. Sometimes they hate your unavailability. You think they hate your tone. Sometimes they hate that your tone no longer trembles. You think they hate your decisions. Sometimes they hate that you made them without needing their permission. Look at ordinary life. The coworker who laughed with you suddenly describes you as difficult after you stop covering his mistakes. The friend who said, "You can always talk to me," grows impatient the moment your pain becomes repetitive instead of entertaining. The family member who calls themselves honest becomes deeply offended when your honesty points in both directions instead of one. There. That little tremor, that little shift, that's where the lie begins to sweat. You have been thinking judgment is a mirror. Sometimes it is a fingerprint. Sometimes it is a stain. Sometimes it is a bruise from their own unfinished battles landing on your face because your face happened to be nearby. And the tragic part? You internalized it. You walked around carrying labels stitched by hands that never even built anything admirable in themselves. Lazy people calling you obsessive. Cowards calling you intense. Users calling you selfish. Weak souls calling you cruel because your mercy finally developed a spine. That is why self-knowledge is not some soft, pretty concept for candles and notebooks and empty motivational posts. No, it is armor. It is discipline. It is the ability to hear a false name shouted at you and not instinctively turn your head. Let them judge you then. But never be so hungry for approval that you start editing your soul to fit mouths that were always going to mispronounce you. Second, you must learn the difference between being misunderstood and being falsely accused by projection. Those are not the same wound. Being misunderstood is sometimes innocent, human, clumsy. It happens when language fails, when timing is bad, when emotion distorts a moment. But projection is uglier. It is when people take what they cannot bear in themselves and nail it to your forehead because seeing it there hurts less. A dishonest person watches you become private and calls you deceptive. An attention addict watches you become quiet and calls you bitter. Someone ruled by envy sees your discipline and names it pride because admitting your effort would expose their excuses. The world does this all the time. Parents who never healed accuse their children of being too sensitive when those children finally describe pain accurately. A spouse who withholds affection suddenly becomes a philosopher about your emotional distance. A friend who gossips about everyone calls you fake because you stopped joining the circus. Do you see it now? Judgment often arrives backwards. The guilty become loud. The careless become moral. The manipulative become deeply offended by boundaries. And if you are soft-hearted, if you are introspective, if you fear becoming unjust yourself, you will examine their accusations more seriously than they ever examined their own behavior. That is how decent people get trapped. They over-interrogate themselves because they know they are capable of imperfection, while shameless people sleep peacefully inside their own distortion. But listen, moral seriousness should make you humble, not available for psychological colonization. You are allowed to reflect without surrendering your entire identity to another person's emotional convenience. You are allowed to ask, "Did I do wrong?" without also asking, "Would you like the keys to my self-respect?" Some of you apologize too fast because you think speed proves goodness. No, sometimes it proves fear. Sometimes it proves you are so terrified of being seen as harsh that you let liars rearrange the furniture in your mind. Stop that. Take a slower breath. Review the pattern. Who benefits from you believing the worst about yourself? Who becomes more comfortable when you shrink? Who looks relieved when you doubt your own memory, your own tone, your own intention? That relief tells a story. Let them judge you, but never confuse a projector's shadow with your actual shape. Third, some judgments are not even about morality. They're about control. That is the part people miss, because control rarely introduces itself honestly. It comes dressed as concern, advice, culture, family values, team spirit, respect, tradition. I'm only saying this for your good. Beautiful phrase. Frequently used by people whose definition of your good ends exactly where their control begins to weaken. A mother says you have become distant, when what she really means is she can no longer guide your emotions with guilt. A friend says success changed you, when what he really means is your growth ended the old power arrangement that let him feel superior. A manager says you are not a team player because you stopped smiling while carrying the labor of 3 people. A circle says you are proud because you stopped asking them to bless every move. That is judgment as discipline, social punishment, emotional policing. Not a search for truth, a demand for compliance. Some of you still think, if I explain myself well enough, they'll finally understand. No. Not always. Not when misunderstanding is profitable. Not when your confusion gives them access. Not when your guilt keeps you obedient. No, they may understand you perfectly. They may simply prefer the version of you that is easier to manage. Watch how quickly humility gets demanded from you by people who never practice it upward, only downward. Watch who calls your independence rebellion, but calls their own interference love. Watch who says, be patient, only when patience benefits their comfort and your delay. And watch how mad they become when you stop asking permission to be a whole person. Because a controlled version of you is useful. A clear version of you is dangerous. The judged person is often just the person who refused to remain easy to arrange. So do not romanticize every misunderstanding. Some of it is strategy. Some of it is a system. Some of it is a room full of people unconsciously cooperating to punish the one soul who no longer wants to act out the old script. If you know who you are before God, before your conscience, before the quiet, private moments where nobody is clapping and nobody is accusing, then let them judge you from the cheap seats. You were not born to become understandable to people invested in your smallness. Fourth, the cruelest judgments usually arrive after transformation. Before that, people tolerate you because they understand your injuries. They know where you bend. They know how to read your hunger, how to predict your softness, how to depend on your self-doubt. But when you begin changing, really changing, Not posting quotes, not acting healed, not performing peace, but actually changing. Something ugly happens. The audience that loved your old fragility starts grieving its own lost access. And grief has strange disguises. It can sound like concern. It can sound like nostalgia. It can sound like, I miss the old you. Ah, the old you. The version who tolerated disrespect longer. The version who answered immediately. The version who handed out explanations like flowers. The version who confused being drained with being needed. Of course they missed that one. That version was easier to enter without knocking. Look at how this happens in real life. A young man starts praying more consistently, speaking less, tightening his circle, respecting his time, and suddenly he is acting different. A woman stops laughing at humiliating jokes, stops rescuing everyone, stops betraying her own fatigue, and suddenly she is too serious. An employee becomes competent enough to say no and instantly turns into hard to work with. Growth threatens people who built their comfort around your previous confusion. That is why transformation attracts judgment like light attracts insects. Not because change is wrong, but because change exposes old arrangements. It reveals who loved your soul and who loved your accessibility. It reveals who wanted your good and who wanted your convenience. And that revelation hurts. Sometimes it hurts more than the original wound. Because now betrayal comes wearing a familiar face, using old, affectionate language, pretending your evolution is cruelty. They say you became cold. No, you became precise. They say you became distant. No, you became harder to exploit. They say you think you're better. No, you finally stopped agreeing to live beneath what you knew was required of you. There is a difference. So when judgment rises after your growth, do not panic immediately. Review the timing. Ask what your change interrupted. Ask whose comfort depended on your confusion. Ask whose ego needed your smaller version to stay alive. Then breathe. Let them judge you. Sometimes judgment is just the sound made by people losing unauthorized access to the person you were becoming all along. Fifth, there is a dark little truth about crowds that nobody wants to say out loud because it sounds cruel, and because admitting it makes public life feel less romantic. People love simple stories more than accurate people. Simplicity is easy to spread. Accuracy is expensive. A group will reduce you faster than an honest person will understand you. One awkward moment, one sharp sentence, one misunderstood silence, one clipped facial expression, one season of withdrawal, and suddenly a whole cheap mythology forms around your name. He's bitter. She's unstable. They're fake. They always thought they were better. Look how quickly complexity dies once gossip gets hungry. And once a crowd agrees on a version of you, many people keep repeating it not because they know it is true, but because social agreement feels safer than independent thought. This is how ordinary cruelty becomes communal. A cousin repeats an accusation she never verified because it keeps the family rhythm intact. Co-workers nod along to the office narrative because questioning it might isolate them. Friends laugh at a distorted version of you because group laughter is less expensive than moral courage. Crowds are often cowards in chorus. And you, sensitive, introspective, painfully alive you, keep trying to respond to all of them one by one, as if truth can chase a rumor at the same speed. It cannot. Rumor rides appetite. Truth walks. That is why over-explaining to the wrong audience becomes self-harm with perfect grammar. The more you scramble to clarify yourself to people who never intended fairness, the guiltier you begin to look to shallow minds. The more paragraphs you give them, the more delicious the performance becomes. They don't even need your explanation to believe you anymore. Your desperation entertains them enough. And that hurts, doesn't it? Because decent people assume clarity leads to peace. Sometimes clarity just gives predators more material. There is wisdom in strategic silence. Not every rumor deserves a courtroom. Not every accuser deserves your biography. Not every false witness deserves front row access to your inner life. Some people are not confused. They are committed. So what do? You tighten your circle. You keep your conduct clean. You stop feeding the theater. You let time expose inconsistency. You let character outlive commentary. You let your private discipline become louder than their public noise. And yes, there will be nights when the injustice burns. Nights when you want to scream every detail. Nights when your chest fills with that old helplessness, that childish ache that says, but that's not what happened. I know, but maturity is not merely feeling pain without expression. It is learning where expression becomes waste. Let them judge you then. Crowds have buried good people under bad stories before. Your responsibility is not to become simple enough for the crowd. It is to remain honest enough before God and yourself that the crowd cannot alter what matters. Sixth, the deepest danger in being judged is not that people speak falsely about you. The deepest danger is that after hearing them long enough, you begin collaborating with the lie. That is the darkest part, not their mouths. Your adoption. The moment an accusation enters the bloodstream and starts sounding like self-knowledge, that is when judgment stops being external weather and becomes internal architecture. You start walking like the label, smiling like the label, apologizing for the label before you've even done anything. You become careful in unnatural ways, dim in unnatural ways, guilty in advance, ashamed in advance, defensive before the conversation has even begun. 1,000 tiny retreats, all because somebody threw a name at you and you were tired enough to wear it. Consider how ordinary this is. A child hears too much for years and becomes an adult who edits every strong feeling before it reaches the room. A boy hears soft every time he shows hurt, so he learns to hide tenderness under mockery and wonders why his relationships taste like distance. A girl hears difficult whenever she voices a need, so she begins offering herself in fragments, then resenting everyone for accepting the cheap version. A wife is called ungrateful every time she names exhaustion, so eventually she thanks people for burdens they should have helped carry. A husband gets treated as selfish for needing quiet, so he starts apologizing for boundaries and calling it compromise, while his soul rots politely in the corner. Do you hear it? The tragedy is not always loud. Sometimes it is administrative, small, daily. It happens in posture, vocabulary, timing. Judgment becomes internalized through repetition and emotional fatigue. Not because the lie was powerful, but because you were human. And human beings start bending toward the voices that repeat themselves most often, especially if those voices arrive from parents, spouses, elders, communities, bosses, people whose approval felt attached to survival. That is why self-interrogation must be disciplined. You cannot just look within, like people say in those clean little soft sentences. No, you must inspect the voices inside you and ask who installed them. Which of these judgments came from sincere moral correction, and which came from frightened people trying to manage your shape? Which inner accusation is actually conscience, and which is just old control wearing a religious or emotional costume? Which shame leads you closer to honesty, and which shame simply makes you smaller for the convenience of others? This matters because there is a kind of false humility that is actually agreement with abuse. There is a kind of self-criticism that feels noble, but is really just surrendered identity. There is a kind of politeness that comes from fear, not character. You say, maybe they're right, not because evidence proved it, but because submission feels less exhausting than defending your reality for another decade. Ah, there it is, the quiet corruption. A lie repeated enough times begins to feel like peace. But peace built on falsehood is not peace. It is sedation. Wake up to that. Wake up before you hand your inner naming rights to people who did not even treat you justly. Real growth requires honest correction, yes. Real faith requires self-accounting, yes. But self-accounting is not self-erasure. Moral seriousness is not emotional slavery. You do not become righteous by accepting every distortion spoken over you. You become steadier by separating deserved correction from undeserved contamination. Some of you have spent years repenting for traits that were never sins, only inconveniences to insecure people. You repented for needing rest, for asking direct questions, for becoming competent, for refusing manipulation, for having standards, for outgrowing a room that kept calling your shrinking good character. No, enough. Look at your life carefully. Where did you become smaller in order to stay likable? Where did you call your fear humility? Where did you rename your exhaustion patience? Because naming it accurately would have forced uncomfortable truth. Where did you accept the title difficult simply because your boundaries interrupted someone else's appetite? Let them judge you, yes, but do not continue their work after they leave the room. That is the real command here. Not merely to endure accusation, but to refuse adoption of what is false. Refuse to help them build a prison inside your own chest. Refuse to narrate yourself in the language of those who benefited from your weakness. Refuse to turn every harsh opinion into holy scripture. You know who you are? Then prove it first in private, not online, not in argument, in private, in the quiet hours where performance dies. Know your intentions. Clean your flaws honestly. Strengthen where you are weak. Repent where you are wrong. Hold the line where you are right. And once you have done that, once your conscience is not running from you, let them choke on their own convenient stories. You do not owe lifelong cooperation to a lie that learned your name. Seventh, there is another reason people judge you, and it is uglier than misunderstanding, uglier than projection, uglier even than control. Sometimes they judge you because your existence exposes what they abandoned in themselves. That is why innocence irritates the compromised. Discipline irritates the indulgent. Quiet strength irritates the theatrical. Integrity irritates the adaptable liar who survives by changing faces every hour. You walk into a room trying to be steady, and someone who long ago made peace with their own inconsistency starts feeling pressure. Not from you directly, from the silent comparison your presence awakens. And because many people cannot bear that pressure honestly, they solve it by judging you downward. He thinks he's holy. She wants attention. They're pretending. Nobody is that sincere. Hear the confession hidden inside those lines? If your goodness is real, then my excuses look cheap. So they attack the authenticity instead. This is one of the loneliest parts of growth. The cleaner your intention becomes, the more aggressively certain people try to contaminate your image so they do not have to feel their own neglect. A man trying to lower his gaze, manage his anger, guard his tongue, work quietly, and stay disciplined gets mocked as fake by people who cannot tolerate the sight of restraint. A woman trying to protect her dignity, preserve her modesty, keep her heart clean, and stop living for attention gets accused of thinking she is better than everyone. An employee who refuses gossip gets labeled arrogant. A student who studies sincerely gets called a show-off by classmates who only respect struggle after it has failed. It's so petty, isn't it? So painfully ordinary. But ordinary cruelty has buried more potential than dramatic evil ever could. You keep waiting for enemies to look monstrous so you can identify them easily. No, often they look familiar, casual, joking. They smile while minimizing you. They compliment you with poison folded inside. You've changed, but like in a weird way. You're doing too much. Relax, it's not that deep. That line, it's not that deep. Frequently spoken by people terrified of depth because depth would force them to meet themselves. And then there is the sadness underneath it all. Because sometimes the judges are people you loved, people you would have carried, people whose pain you understood, people you excused, defended, fed, protected. And when they judge you, it hurts differently, because the mind cannot decide which wound to tend first, the slander or the memory of what you were to them. You start replaying old conversations, old favors, old tenderness, old nights of support, wondering how someone who knew your heart this closely could reduce you so lazily now. That is where some people break. Not because the accusation was clever, but because it came from a familiar mouth. Familiar mouths can still lie. Familiar eyes can still become envious. Familiar hands can still point when the crowd does. Love does not automatically purify people. Proximity does not automatically deepen fairness. Sometimes closeness just gives people better data for their betrayal. So what do you do with this? You stop demanding impossible guarantees from human beings. You stop saying, "But they know me." Yes, they may know you and still judge falsely when your growth inconveniences their self-image. They may know your goodness and still reduce you in public because joining the mockery is socially cheaper than honoring the truth. And you must stop collapsing every time this happens, as if justice from people was promised to you in this life. It was not. You are responsible for your character, not for the fairness of every witness. You are responsible for staying clean in your actions, not for managing the fantasy lives others need in order to excuse their own decay. Sometimes all you can do is stand there, quiet, burning, deeply human, almost laughing from the absurdity of it, and let your life answer later. Not a crazy laugh of collapse. No, something darker, thinner, more knowing. The laugh of someone realizing just how much of the world runs on insecure people calling truth performance, because performance is all they understand. Let them judge you. Let them kneel before their own small narratives. But never let their insecurity trick you into self-betrayal. If your heart knows the intention, if your private conduct stays cleaner than their public description, if your conscience still breathes when the lights go out, then keep walking. Some people do not hate your flaws. They hate what your discipline makes their neglect impossible to ignore. Their judgment is not your verdict. It is their escape route. Eighth, one of the hardest disciplines in the world is to remain soft-hearted without remaining publicly fragile. Most people never learn this. They swing between extremes. Either they stay so open that every foolish opinion enters the bloodstream, or they become so armored that nothing reaches them anymore. Not love, not guidance, not mercy, not truth. But the mature soul must do something much more difficult. It must preserve tenderness before God and conscience while becoming ungovernable by shallow judgment. That balance is violent work on the inside, because some nights you really do want to harden completely. When the mockery repeats, when the false stories multiply, when the people who benefited from your gentleness rewrite history and call themselves the victim of your awakening, you want to become iron. No softness, no explanation, no tears, just cold function. But be careful. The world is full of wounded people who responded to injustice by becoming emotionally unavailable and called that strength. It is not always strength. Sometimes it is just unprocessed humiliation wearing dark clothes. Looks powerful from a distance, feels hollow up close. So the goal is not to become stone. The goal is to become selective. To know who deserves access to your tenderness and who only ever deserved your politeness. To know when silence is dignity and when silence is cowardice. To know when explanation is mercy and when explanation is a relapse into the old addiction to being accepted by people who already made their choice. Ordinary life tests this constantly. A sibling provokes you in front of others because the old family role assigned to you was the emotional one, and they panic when you stop performing it. A friend pushes your buttons publicly because your calm exposes his immaturity. A spouse tries to bait you into defending every choice you made because control weakens when your peace remains unhooked. A coworker repeats a subtle insult to see whether the old insecure version of you still lives there, waiting to over-explain. You feel it, don't you? That old heat in the chest, the throat tightening, the mind rushing to present evidence. That is the threshold moment. The moment where spiritual and psychological maturity either stand up or collapse. Not every arrow deserves a dramatic removal in public. Some arrows are made of cardboard. Let them land. Let them embarrass only the one who shot them. But this does not mean becoming passive. No. It means choosing your field. Correct clearly when necessary. Walk away clearly when necessary. Confront precisely when necessary. But stop reacting out of that frantic inner child who still believes survival depends on being interpreted kindly by everyone in the room. It does not. Survival now depends on your ability to remain inwardly truthful without becoming outwardly theatrical. And yes, there is sadness in this, because part of you still longs for the simpler world where sincerity would be recognized immediately, where honesty would be rewarded quickly, where being misunderstood could be fixed with one conversation and a sincere face. That world, maybe it visits in flashes, in good people, in blessed moments, but it is not guaranteed everywhere. So you must grow larger than disappointment without becoming smaller in spirit. You must let pain educate you without turning you into one of those bitter little judges you use to survive. That is the trap. To be falsely reduced so often that you begin reducing everyone else first. To be mocked so much that mockery becomes your native language. To be judged so much that you turn judgment into instinct. Do not become that. Do not let the injustice done to you become the style with which you move through the world. Keep your standards, yes. Keep your boundaries, yes. Keep your seriousness, yes. But do not lose the ability to recognize goodness when it finally arrives just because counterfeits exhausted you. Let them judge you. Let them guess. Let them shrink you in conversation if that is all their little emotional budget allows. Your job is harder and holier. To remain clear without becoming cruel, guarded without becoming dead, private without becoming false, strong without worshiping hardness. If you know who you are, then you do not owe the room panic. You owe it composure. And you owe your soul the mercy of not turning every misunderstanding into a referendum on your value. Conclusion. Let them judge you. No, deeper than that. Let them exhaust themselves trying to reduce what they never had the patience to study. Let them perform certainty. Let them trade your name like cheap currency. Let them call your boundaries arrogance, your quiet bitterness, your seriousness pride, your transformation fakery, your self-respect rebellion, your caution cruelty, your discipline obsession, your withdrawal offense. Let them do all of it. But when the room empties, when the lights fall, when the noise finally crawls back into the mouths that made it, there is still the oldest question waiting for you in the dark. Do you know who you are when nobody is misnaming you? Because that is the battlefield. Not the gossip, not the whisper network, not the strained family dinner, not the office story, not the social performance. The battlefield is the private chamber where you either remain loyal to what is true or slowly sell it for relief. And relief is seductive. Relief will offer you so many deals. Just explain one more time. Just soften your standards. Just laugh at what wounded you. Just become easier to control. Just return to the older, smaller, more convenient version of yourself so the room will calm down. No. No. If the price of being understood by shallow people is self-betrayal, then misunderstanding is cheaper. If the price of social comfort is inner distortion, then exile is cleaner. If the price of public approval is private disgust, then approval is filth dressed as reward. Do you hear me? Stop kneeling emotionally before mouths that do not even speak to themselves honestly. Stop measuring your worth with rulers carved by insecurity, envy, convenience, and half-fed egos. Stop calling yourself lost simply because people invested in your smallness cannot recognize your newer shape. There will be pain in this. Let's not lie. There will be nights when the old ache returns, when some false sentence cuts with surgical precision because it came from someone whose voice still lives somewhere in your bones. There will be moments when your chest tightens and your mind starts building imaginary courtrooms, imaginary speeches, imaginary scenes where finally, they understand. Maybe they won't. Maybe some of them will die misunderstanding you because that misunderstanding protected too much of what they refused to confront in themselves. And you must be able to survive that without becoming theatrical, tyrannical, or spiritually rotten. That is your task. Not to win every witness, to remain clean before the witness that matters most. Not to edit yourself into universal palatability. To become so inwardly aligned that false judgment lands and finds no vacancy. Not to grow numb, to grow rooted. Imagine how terrifying that is to shallow people. The person they misnamed refuses collapse, refuses performance, refuses revenge, refuses begging, refuses costume, refuses to become digestible, and just keeps walking with a steadier pulse than before. That is power they do not know how to insult properly. So let them try. Let them work. Let them stretch language until it embarrasses them. Meanwhile, you do your harder work. Clean your actual faults. Guard your tongue. Protect your prayer. Refine your intention. Keep your promises. Carry your grief with dignity. Learn when to speak and when to deprive fools of your biography. Learn when to forgive and when to close the door quietly. Learn that mercy without boundaries becomes an invitation to contempt, and boundaries without mercy become a religion of ego. Stay balanced. Stay dangerous in the clean way, dangerous to manipulation, dangerous to shame tactics, dangerous to false narratives, dangerous to every old system that fed on your confusion. Because once you know who you are, once you have sat alone long enough to hear your own conscience without the static of frightened people, once you have made peace with the fact that not everybody gets access to the truth of you, then judgment starts sounding smaller. Still annoying, still sharp sometimes, still humanly painful, but smaller, like dogs barking behind a gate. So let them judge you. Let them gather. Let them misunderstand. Let them gossip, sigh, speculate, moralize, simplify, and perform. You know who you are. And if you truly know, if you have earned that knowledge through honest self-accounting, repentance where needed, discipline where needed, silence where needed, courage where needed, then their noise is not your identity. Their sentence is not your scripture. Their version is not your soul. Walk quietly, cleanly, relentlessly. Let them judge you. Let them get tired. Let them guess. And let your life remain something they were never deep enough to describe.